This story is called A Judge Sentences a Black Teenager to Prison, Not Knowing That His Lawyer Is His Mother, one of the best lawyers in the country. Hey, before we get into today's video, I need your help. Subscribing is one of the best ways to support us. It's fast, free, and helps us continue to bring you amazing content. Your support means a lot. Thank you so much. Now let's get into the story. Judge Tolson didn't even blink when he handed down the sentence. 5 years in juvenile detention. Case closed. The gavel slammed down. The courtroom fell silent. 17-year-old Darius sat at the defendant's table, his whole body numb. He hadn't done anything wrong. Nothing. But none of that mattered. He was the wrong person, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. In this judge's eyes, he had been guilty from the start. Somewhere in the gallery, a muffled sob broke the silence. His grandmother, Mrs. Williams. Next to him, his mother didn't move. Camille Johnson sat perfectly still, her face unreadable. Everyone in that room knew her as a brilliant attorney. What they didn't know, what Judge Tolson didn't know, was that she was Darius's mother. The prosecutor smirked. The bailiffs moved in, ready to escort Darius away. Everything was going according to plan. Another black boy was about to disappear into the system. Then Camille stood up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady and clear. "This ruling is a gross miscarriage of justice. I move to challenge the verdict." Heads turned. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Counselor, this hearing is over." She crossed her arms. "No. It's just getting started." Judge Tolson let out an irritated sigh. "If you have objections, file an appeal." Camille tilted her head. "Oh, I will. But first, I have a few questions." She turned to the prosecutor, who was still standing by his desk, that smug grin plastered across his face. "You claimed my client's fingerprints were found at the crime scene. Correct?" "Correct," he said smoothly. "Then why does the forensic report state that no usable prints were recovered at all?" A flicker of unease crossed his face. "Probably a clerical error," he muttered. Camille nodded slowly. "All right. Let's talk about your star witness. You're aware he was dismissed from the police force for falsifying evidence, right?" Judge Tolson frowned. "That's irrelevant." "It's completely relevant. This man has a history of lying under oath, and you built your entire case around his testimony." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. The judge looked tense. "And then there's the security footage," Camille continued. "The one that mysteriously went missing." She slapped a thick folder onto the table. "I have a copy." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Tolson's jaw tightened. "You can't introduce new evidence like this." "I can when it proves my client's innocence." She took a step toward the judge and met his eyes, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Darius is my son." The courtroom went dead silent. For the first time that day, Judge Tolson looked genuinely caught off guard. He blinked once, then quickly masked his reaction. "That doesn't change anything," he said, his voice tight. Camille let out a cold, humorless laugh. "Oh, but it does. It changes everything." She turned to the jury, making sure each of them was looking at her. "They want you to believe this is just another routine case. Another black boy who made a bad choice and has to face the consequences. That's how the system works, right? They don't need real evidence. They don't need a fair trial. They just need someone to blame." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, his confidence visibly cracking. Camille turned back to Judge Tolson. "Your Honor, let's talk about your record. 85 juvenile cases in the last 5 years." She pulled out a thick file and flipped it open. "You dismissed charges for exactly 3 white teenagers. Every single black defendant?" "Guilty. Every single one." Judge Tolson's face darkened. "This is outrageous," he barked. "You're making baseless accusations." "Oh, I'm just getting started. She turned to the courtroom gallery and held up another file. Copies of formal complaints against Your Honor, all alleging racial bias in sentencing. Multiple families have filed appeals, but none of them ever got anywhere. Know why? Because every single case conveniently lacked the necessary grounds for review. Now the whole room was buzzing. Some jurors were exchanging uneasy glances. A reporter in the back furiously scribbled notes. The prosecutor shot out of his chair. Objection. This is completely inappropriate. Sustained, Judge Tolson snapped. Camille just smiled. Of course you'd say that. Because you know what happens if this gets out. You know what happens when people start connecting the dots. She turned to the bailiff standing near Darius. And you, officer? You arrested my son, right? Said he matched the description. Tell me, what was that description again? The officer hesitated. Black male, late teens. That's it, she snapped. That's all you had? A vague description that could fit half the kids in this city? The officer's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Camille nodded and turned back to the judge. Your Honor, if you don't overturn this verdict right now, I guarantee you, this case won't just be about my son. It'll be about you. About every single wrongful conviction you've handed down. About every black boy you threw behind bars without a second thought. And when I'm done, you won't just be off the bench. You'll be in a courtroom, on the other side of the damn bench, fighting to keep yourself out of prison. The judge's face went pale. The prosecutor looked like he wanted to disappear. Tolson cleared his throat, struggling to keep control. This is highly irregular. Camille folded her arms. Then do the regular thing, Judge. Overturn the verdict. Silence stretched across the room. The judge gritted his teeth. His hands clenched into fists on the bench. And then, finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "The conviction is vacated. The case is dismissed." The room exploded. Darius let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His grandmother started crying again, but this time it was out of relief. The reporters scrambled to get their headlines out first. Camille didn't react. She just exhaled slowly, then turned to her son. "Let's go home." But as she led him out of the courthouse, she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Judge Tolson's face was stiff, his jaw tight. The weight of the courtroom was pressing down on him now. He could feel it. This wasn't how today was supposed to go. "This is not a trial about me," he snapped, gripping the bench. "This is about a young man accused of a serious crime." Camille tilted her head, her expression as sharp as a blade. "A crime he didn't commit," she corrected. "A crime that was never properly investigated. A crime that was pinned on him because he was convenient." The room was no longer on his side. The jurors shifted in their seats. The prosecutor wiped his brow. Even the bailiffs, usually impassive, were standing rigidly, like they weren't sure where to look. And then Camille delivered the final blow. "You want to talk about serious crimes, Your Honor?" She pulled out a thin folder, thinner than the others, but 10 times as deadly. "Let's talk about yours." She handed a document to the court clerk. "Go ahead. Read it." The clerk hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Formal investigation into judicial misconduct, filed by the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice." The room gasped. Judge Tolson's face drained of color. "That's enough." His voice was lower now, but the crack in it was undeniable. Camille wasn't finished. "Oh no, Your Honor, we're just getting started." She turned to the audience. "See, while I was preparing my son's defense, I did a little digging. Turns out, I'm not the only lawyer who's raised concerns about Judge Tolson's sentencing record." She gestured toward the back of the room. Heads turned as 2 men in suits stood up. They weren't reporters. They weren't family members of the accused. They were federal investigators. Judge Tolson swallowed hard. The taller of the two men stepped forward. "We've been looking into your Honor's sentencing patterns for a while," he said, his voice calm but firm. "The racial disparities are alarming." Tolson's hands gripped the bench so tightly his knuckles turned white. Camille smirked. "So, tell me, Your Honor," she said, her voice softer now, but just as lethal. "Still think this trial isn't about you?" The judge's gaze darted to the prosecutor, looking for support, but the man had already started gathering his papers, wanting no part in this. Panic flickered across Tolson's face. He had two choices. Fight this and risk exposing even more dirt? Or cut his losses and save himself while he still could? The courtroom was waiting. Finally, his shoulders sagged. "The conviction is vacated," he muttered, barely audible. Camille leaned in slightly. "Sorry, Your Honor. Didn't catch that." Tolson's eyes burned with rage. He gritted his teeth, then spoke louder. "The conviction is vacated. The case is dismissed." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, cheers, murmurs, chaos. Darius let out a breath like he'd been underwater for hours. His grandmother sobbed into her hands, overwhelmed with relief. Camille took a slow step back, her work done. But as she turned to walk away, she caught Tolson's eyes one last time. This wasn't over. Not for him. Not for the system. And certainly not for her. The courtroom was a storm of voices, some outraged, some triumphant. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Spectators whispered frantically to one another. But in the middle of all the chaos, Darius just sat there, stunned. His mother had done it. He was free. The weight of what had just happened was sinking in, slow and heavy. 5 minutes ago, his life was over. 5 minutes ago, he was nothing but another black boy the system had decided to swallow whole. And now? Now, Judge Tolson looked like he had just been sentenced himself. The federal agents were already moving toward him, their presence unmistakable. One of them leaned in and murmured something under his breath. Tolson's face darkened even more. His grip on the bench tightened like he was trying to hold on to the last scraps of control. The prosecutor had completely checked out, already making a beeline for the exit like he wanted to erase himself from this whole disaster. And Camille? She was as calm as ever, watching the house of cards collapse exactly the way she had planned. She turned to Darius and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let's go," she murmured. He swallowed hard and nodded, standing up on shaky legs. His grandmother was already there, pulling him into a fierce hug, tears still streaming down her face. "I told you, baby," she whispered. "God, don't sleep." As they made their way toward the exit, the voices of reporters started cutting through the air. "Ms. Johnson. Do you have a statement?" "Judge Tolson, do you deny the accusations?" "Sir, is it true there's a formal federal investigation against you?" Tolson ignored them, his face rigid, but everyone could see it now, he wasn't untouchable anymore. The cracks in the system had finally broken open. Camille paused just long enough to glance back at him. "You should resign," she said, her voice casual but sharp as a knife. Tolson didn't respond. Because he knew she was right. As Camille stepped out into the open air, the sun hit her face, warm and bright. The weight in her chest, the one she had carried since the moment her son had been arrested, finally started to lift. But she wasn't naive. This wasn't the end. Darius wasn't the first black boy who had almost been buried by the system. And he sure as hell wouldn't be the last. Camille took a slow breath and looked at her son, who was still trying to process the fact that he wasn't in handcuffs anymore. "It's over, right?" he asked quietly. She gave him a small, tired smile. "For you?" "Yes." Then she looked back at the courthouse, at the system that had tried to destroy her child without a second thought. "For them?" Her smile faded. "Not even close."